It was a quiet night in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean. The USS Indianapolis, a proud and powerful warship, sliced through the waves, carrying a crew of over 1,000 men. Their mission was top secret, delivering crucial components of the atomic bomb to a base in the Pacific. After completing their mission, they began their journey back to the Philippines, unaware that the ocean surrounding them would soon become their grave. As the night wore on, the crew relaxed, thinking the worst was behind them. The air was calm, the water smooth. It seemed like a routine journey, nothing more than the hum of the engines, the occasional chatter from the men, and the distant horizon. The world above them was peaceful, yet beneath the surface, a storm was already brewing. At 12:15 a.m., the silence was shattered by the deafening roar of torpedoes ripping through the ship's hull. The USS Indianapolis was struck by 2 deadly hits from a Japanese submarine, the I-58. The ship groaned and buckled, the immense force of the blast sending shock waves through her metal frame. In seconds, the warship was torn apart, and the mighty vessel that had sailed with such pride began to sink beneath the ocean's depths. The crew, thrown into chaos, scrambled to escape, but many didn't make it. In the wake of the explosion, the surviving sailors were left in a nightmare, floating in the open sea, with no land in sight. The ocean had claimed the Indianapolis, but the real horror was just beginning. The USS Indianapolis was one of the Navy's most trusted warships, a heavy cruiser built to strike fear into the hearts of enemies. It had seen action across the Pacific during World War II, but in July of 1945, she was tasked with what would become her most significant mission, that no one aboard could have anticipated would also be her last. On July 16th, after a top-secret mission, the USS Indianapolis set sail from San Francisco to the Pacific island of Tinian. There, she delivered the crucial components of the atomic bomb, the weapon that would bring an end to the war in the Pacific. The mission was successful, though largely unheralded. With the bomb components safely delivered, the crew was relieved, eager to return to their home port in the Philippines. They were just days away from completing the mission that would end the war. There was a sense of optimism aboard the ship, a quiet belief that the worst was behind them. They had done their duty, and victory seemed near. But no one aboard the Indianapolis knew that they had just entered the most perilous waters they would ever sail. The ship's journey was uneventful at first. The night air was warm, the sea calm. The sailors had no reason to suspect danger, no reason to believe that what should have been a routine trip would turn into one of the most horrific naval disasters in history. The ship had no escort, no accompanying destroyers or other vessels. She sailed alone, a symbol of independence and power. The Navy believed she could handle any threat that came her way, a belief that would soon prove tragically false. The crew, now thousands of miles from their mission's success, were unwinding, relaxing into their routine. Most were on deck, enjoying the quiet evening as they sailed deeper into the Pacific. Some men took to their posts, while others gathered to chat, their voices mingling with the hum of the engines. Meanwhile, just beneath the surface, the Japanese submarine I-58 lay in wait, its crew readying their deadly weapons. The submarine had been shadowing the Indianapolis, waiting for the right moment to strike. At 12:15 a.m., that moment came. 2 torpedoes sliced through the water, slamming into the Indianapolis with brutal precision. The explosion was deafening, the shock of it rattling the entire ship. The Indianapolis lurched violently, and a huge hole was torn in her side. The ship began to sink almost immediately, chaos erupting among the crew. Many were killed instantly, their lives extinguished in an instant by the force of the blast. For the others, the situation became a desperate race for survival. In those initial moments, the panic was overwhelming. The ship was sinking fast, and the crew, many of them unprepared for the immediate disaster, struggled to escape. Men rushed for lifeboats, but with the ship tilting sharply, many were unable to launch them. Those who managed to reach the water found themselves helpless in the open ocean. And for those who weren't so lucky, their fate was sealed as the Indianapolis plunged beneath the waves. By the time the ship disappeared from sight, the sea had claimed hundreds of lives. But for the survivors, the true horror was just beginning. Trapped in the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific, with no land in sight, their nightmare would unfold slowly, painfully. The Indianapolis was gone, but the men left behind would soon realize that their fight for survival was only just beginning. The moment the torpedo struck, the calm of the Pacific was shattered. The explosion, so powerful it seemed to tear the ship in two, reverberated through the entire vessel. The USS Indianapolis, a symbol of naval might, groaned as her hull buckled under the impact. For a brief moment, there was an eerie silence, and then chaos erupted. The first blast had been catastrophic. In an instant, a massive hole was torn in the Indianapolis's side, flooding the lower decks with seawater. The ship began to tilt violently to port. The crew, who had been unwinding just moments before, were thrown into a nightmare, their world upended. The force of the explosion knocked many men off their feet, and in the chaos, the ship's crew raced to the lifeboats, some managing to climb to safety, others trapped below deck, unable to escape in time. A second torpedo hit moments later, exacerbating the damage. Water poured in at an alarming rate, flooding the engine room, and soon the ship's lights flickered and died. Communication systems failed. The Indianapolis had no way to send a distress signal, and the Navy would remain unaware of the disaster until it was too late. The men who managed to reach the lifeboats or find any form of flotation were now at the mercy of the sea. The once proud ship, filled with life and purpose, was sinking rapidly. Within just 12 minutes, the Indianapolis had disappeared below the waves. In the span of mere minutes, over 300 men had been lost to the depths, and the remaining crew found themselves stranded in the open ocean. In the aftermath of the explosion, there was no time to mourn. The survivors found themselves in the water, staring out into the vast, empty Pacific. The ship was gone, and so many of their brothers in arms were now beneath the sea. They were left alone, drifting in the blackness, surrounded by nothing but the endless expanse of ocean. The sound of the water lapping against the wreckage was the only noise now, the eerie silence punctuated by the occasional scream or cry for help. There were no lifeboats for everyone. Only a handful had made it to the few available boats, while the rest clung to wreckage, desperately trying to stay afloat. Their hopes of rescue were slim. They were in the middle of the Pacific, far from any land, and the night had already fallen, adding to the oppressive feeling of isolation. Many of the survivors were injured, some from the explosion, others from the debris of the ship or the violent impact of being thrown into the water. The hours dragged on. The men were cold, soaked to the bone, and terrified. With no food, no water, and no way to contact help, they were faced with the brutal reality that they might not survive. The fear set in quickly, but what followed was something even worse. The realization that rescue might never come. The ocean, once so serene, now seemed to swallow them whole, offering only uncertainty and the overwhelming sense of abandonment. The Indianapolis had disappeared beneath the waves, leaving behind a dark void in the vastness of the Pacific. What had once been a bustling warship, filled with life, was now a sunken wreck, and those who had survived the explosion and the sinking were left floating on the open sea, surrounded by nothing but the endless horizon. In the early hours after the disaster, there was a sense of stunned disbelief among the survivors. The realization that the ship had sunk so quickly and so many men had been lost was too much for some to comprehend. The survivors clinging to bits of wreckage, small rafts, or anything that could keep them above water tried to comfort each other, but the fear and confusion were overwhelming. The survivors had no idea where they were. They were somewhere in the Pacific, but the ocean stretched out before them like an endless, impenetrable expanse. There were no stars to guide them, no land in sight, just the oppressive darkness and the feeling that they were utterly alone. Many of them were too disoriented to think clearly, while others were already succumbing to shock. All they could do was try to hold on and wait for rescue, but none of them knew when that would come, or if it ever would. The first hours were the hardest. The men were scattered, separated by vast distances in the water. Some had managed to secure spots on lifeboats, but others were left clinging to debris, bobbing in the water with nothing to keep them afloat but their sheer will to survive. The ocean, once an expansive and seemingly endless source of freedom, had become their greatest enemy. As the sun began to rise, the true horror of their situation became clear. The heat of the day beat down mercilessly on the survivors, their skin scorched by the burning sun. They had no fresh water, no food, and only a limited chance of survival. The thirst became unbearable. The salt water they drank only worsened their dehydration, and their bodies began to break down in the relentless heat. But it wasn't just the thirst or the hunger that gnawed at them. It was the ever-present fear that they would never be found, that they would remain lost at sea forever. Their radio was useless, the lifeboats too small to carry many of them. The ship's sinking had left them vulnerable, without proper supplies or any means of communication. The ocean, vast and uncaring, seemed to mock their struggle for survival. As the hours turned to days, hope began to fade. Men began to fall unconscious from exhaustion and exposure to the sun. The reality of the situation began to set in. Rescue might never come. As the survivors tried to hold on, they faced a grim future, a slow death in the unforgiving ocean, the chance of being found slipping away with every passing hour. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, salt water, and fear. Many of the men had wounds, some from the explosion, others from the jagged pieces of debris they had been forced to cling to. Yet, despite the pain and the overwhelming desire to give in, they kept floating, driven by the faint hope that someone would come for them. Every day without rescue felt like another day of torture, but still they held on. But as the days stretched into an unbearable, sun-scorched eternity, the men began to realize that the fight for survival wasn't just about keeping their bodies alive, it was about keeping their minds intact. The isolation, the constant exposure to the harsh elements, the fear of what was lurking beneath the water, these things wore at their sanity. And soon, the survivors would learn that the sea held not just the promise of death, but something far worse, the terror of the unknown. As the survivors drifted through the vast ocean, their bodies slowly beginning to weaken, another terror emerged from the depths. The sun had now been beating down on them for days, scorching their skin, and the thirst had reached a fever pitch. With no fresh water and no food, their strength was rapidly fading. The men, once proud soldiers, now felt more like mere shadows of their former selves, exhausted, delirious, and desperate. But the ocean, in all its merciless vastness, wasn't done with them yet. From the moment they hit the water, the men had been at the mercy of the elements. But now, they faced something far more terrifying than dehydration, hunger, or fatigue. In the dark, silent waters around them, something was moving. They couldn't see it, but they could feel its presence, lurking just beneath the surface. It was the sharks. At first, the men thought it was a trick of the mind, a shadow, perhaps, or a momentary glimpse of a creature beneath the waves. But soon, it became undeniable. The sharks began to circle. One by one, the survivors began to spot them. The dark shapes darting just out of sight, their fins cutting through the water like knives. The men knew that sharks were a constant threat in the open ocean, but now it was personal. Every time they heard the faint splash of a fin slicing through the water, every ripple seemed to send a new wave of panic through the already fragile group. The sharks weren't simply swimming by, they were drawn to the men, attracted by the scent of blood. Whether from the explosion, from wounds sustained in the ship's destruction, or from the natural wear and tear of survival, the sharks began to circle more aggressively. The men, already weakened by days of dehydration and sun exposure, now had to fight for their very lives against these relentless predators. The survivors screamed out in terror as the first shark struck, pulling one man from a raft into the depths. It happened so quickly. One moment the man was there, the next he was gone, swallowed by the dark waters. The men scrambled in panic, trying to push away from the jaws of death, but the sharks were relentless. As soon as one survivor vanished beneath the surface, another would be pulled under, disappearing into the vast abyss. Desperation set in. There was no place to run, no escape. The survivors were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The ocean, vast and indifferent, was now a deadly trap. And the worst part, the sharks weren't the only enemy they had to face. The hunger and dehydration were gnawing at them, the salt water leaving their bodies weak and fragile. The men were starting to hallucinate, some already slipping in and out of consciousness, unsure whether the sharks were real or just another terrifying vision brought on by the madness of the sea. As the days dragged on, more men were lost to the sharks. The survivors had no way to protect themselves. They could only watch as the creatures of the deep claimed more of their comrades. With each death, the group became smaller, their chances of survival diminishing. They were caught in an inescapable hell, one that the ocean seemed to relish, and the sharks seemed to be the living embodiment of that unrelenting horror. The fear of the sharks soon became all-consuming. The men, exhausted and unable to think clearly, began to see the predators in every dark ripple, every shadow beneath the water. As the hours turned into days, and the days turned into a blur of pain and terror, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. The sharks were now not just a threat, They were a symbol of the unforgiving brutality of the ocean itself. But even as more men were taken by the sharks, others were left to fight on, clinging to what little hope they had left. The survivors were now living in a world where the ocean didn't just threaten them, it was actively trying to claim them. The sharks were just one more horror they would have to endure before they could ever hope to make it out of this hell alive. 4 days at sea. 4 days of unimaginable suffering, both physical and mental. For the survivors of the USS Indianapolis, each passing hour was like an eternity. They had endured the brutality of the open ocean, the relentless sun, the gnawing hunger, the terrifying presence of sharks, and the constant threat of death. Their bodies were failing them, cracked, sunburned, dehydrated, and mutilated. And yet, despite everything, they held on, clinging to the faintest hope that someone would come, that someone would find them. Then, on the morning of the 4th day, a miracle happened. A plane flew overhead, a Navy plane, the kind that would have been sent to search for the wreckage, to find the survivors. The men, too weak to cry out, barely had the strength to signal. But somehow, the plane spotted them. Maybe it was the desperation in their eyes, or the subtle glint of the wreckage still floating in the water, or just sheer luck. But after days of isolation, a glimmer of hope finally pierced through the darkness. The plane circled, and then it flew away. For a terrifying moment, the survivors thought they had been seen only to be ignored. But minutes later, another plane appeared, this one with a rescue team aboard. And this time, they weren't going to let the men die. They were coming for them. A rescue operation was launched. It was slow, difficult, and painful. Many of the survivors were so far gone they could barely move. They had lost everything: strength, energy, hope. Some were delirious, others in shock. But with each rescue, one by one, they were lifted from the ocean's cold, merciless embrace. As the survivors were pulled from the water, they were barely recognizable, their bodies skeletal, their eyes sunken from dehydration and exposure. And yet, they had made it against all odds. They had survived the unthinkable. But the rescue did not come without cost. By the time the last of the survivors were pulled from the water, over 880 men had been lost, their bodies claimed by the sea or torn apart by the sharks. Only 317 men, less than a third of the crew, had survived the nightmare. Many of them would never fully recover from the horrors they had endured, physically or mentally. The psychological trauma, the memories of their fallen comrades, would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They would carry the weight of those lost days at sea, the screams of their brothers in arms still echoing in their minds. The Indianapolis had been a symbol of American strength, but after the sinking, the ship would be remembered for something far darker: the failure of the military to act quickly enough to rescue the men, and the incredible suffering they endured in the open sea. The tragedy of the Indianapolis was not just about the loss of life, but about the betrayal of those left behind, forgotten for days, alone in the unforgiving Pacific, until they were nearly beyond saving. The survivors who made it back would eventually tell their story, but not all of them. Some would remain silent, unable to relive the horrors they had experienced, and for many, the rescue was just the beginning of a much longer battle with the ghosts of the past, the men they had lost, and the ocean that had tried to claim them all. The USS Indianapolis disaster became one of the most tragic and well-known events in American naval history. But for those who lived through it, it was a reminder of the brutal reality of war and survival, of how, in the end, the ocean gives no mercy, and life can be lost in the blink of an eye. The horror of the USS Indianapolis disaster will never be forgotten. The men who survived that nightmare, and those who didn't, are forever etched in history as a symbol of endurance in the face of unimaginable suffering. But the real cost of their survival went beyond the ocean. It left scars that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The sea claimed many lives that day, but for the survivors, it would never let them forget. The terrifying ordeal of the Indianapolis remains a somber reminder of the harsh reality of war and the cruelty of the elements when survival hangs by a thread. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a real-life horror story. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What other tragic events would you like us to explore? Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some stories, like the ocean, are deeper and darker than we could ever imagine.